Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to another episode behind beliefs and behaviors. And and I'm Dr. Maiysha, and I'm the host, and I'm so excited to be here. And so today I want to talk about why misunderstandings happen. Now, the truth is, there are many, many reasons why misunderstandings can happen, but there are two foundational things I want to share about today that when you hear them, you may think, oh, well, of course. However, in your awareness day to day, moment to moment, interaction to interaction, how aware are you that you're doing this thing? All right. Because if you've watched my TEDx talk, you know I talk often about the filters that sort of drive our behaviors and our responses. And so oftentimes this is happening at the unconscious level. And if you know me, you know I love to reveal how the unconscious mind is often running the show, even though we think we are consciously running the show. So I want to get into it. So the first thing that is the first thing that we do, the first thing that is automatic that we do when we interact with people, when we're communicating, is we make assumptions. Now, that may seem obvious to you that, oh, yes, of course we make assumptions, but we tend to assume the worst before we assume the best. Right. So we're conditioned in our society to think worst case scenario. What is the worst case scenario? And oftentimes, when we are listening, when we're communicating, most people are in their head thinking about what they're going to say next, making assumptions, only picking up bits and pieces of what's actually being communicated. And from those bits and pieces, making assumptions. And oftentimes, we are in this negative assumptive mode. Now, why is that? Why is that? Because oftentimes when we're in communication, we are in our protect mode. We are in our a bit in defensive mode. And again, we're conditioned to be that way. When you're growing up, you're conditioned to protect yourself. And when we think about how the brain works, and we think about trauma, and even before before we get to the extreme of trauma, we think about stress and the way the brain is always scanning for a threat, always scanning for danger. And so the unconscious mind, the brain's highest prime directive, or the unconscious mind's highest prime directive, is to protect and preserve the body. Now, we don't distinguish necessarily between physical protection, psychological, emotional protection, social protection. It all lands the same inside of us. And so when we're in communication, especially if that communication is conflict, or if it's uh, we're being evaluated, we're being in what feels like interrogated, but we're being asked a question, asked to present our knowledge, sometimes that can land as threat. Now, why is that the case? Well, we could do a whole podcast about what happened in our childhood. What is it that has happened in our past that has things like being asked questions or being asked to present our knowledge occur as a threat, right? We can ask those questions. You can even ask that of yourself. But at the end of the day, the end result is we're always making these negative assumptions. And we assume the worst, not only of intention, but we also assume the worst about the other person. And that can be dangerous, because then what happens is we jump to judge. We jump to judge. And that leads me to the second thing, which we fail to clarify. We fail to clarify not only what we're hearing, but we fail to clarify if the other person understands or has heard what we're actually trying to communicate. So, what happens is we have a person who's making assumptions, and sometimes assuming the worst outcome. Now, sometimes it's not that you're assuming the worst about a person. You may be assuming good intention and still unconsciously, because you're in the protect mode, because we sort of are conditioned to be in protect mode, we may be assuming unconsciously the worst outcome. And so that puts us in this defense mode in our communication. And rather than listening, we're in our minds trying to think of what is the response that's going to give us the higher ground, give us the upper hand, give us the most leverage, right? So we're always looking for leverage because we're always in that competitive mode. And that competitive mode is coming really, what's behind that is coming from the protect mode. And what is the protect mode coming from? Well, at the bottom of that is some type of fear, right? What are we afraid we're going to lose? What are we afraid that we're not going to gain? What are we afraid that are we afraid? What are we afraid that we're being threatened by? What part of our personality or our intelligence or our capacity or capability do we feel could be threatened if we don't gain the upper hand, if we don't gain the leverage in the conversation? So we're talking all about communication here, right? This is we're talking very specifically about communication. And this is how people listen and this is how people speak. This is what's behind oftentimes the misunderstanding, the conflict that can come. Because if we are so concerned with gaining the upper hand, if we're so concerned with gaining leverage, if we're so concerned with protecting ourselves, and it's not to say that there's not necessarily a reason. Maybe we've experienced something in the past. Maybe you're in a toxic environment or what occurs or feels like a toxic, stressful environment on an ongoing basis that primes the body for you to be on edge. So I'm not saying that there aren't reasons, but what I am saying is where misunderstandings occur is when we are listening from this space, then we can't actually always hear what's behind the communication, what's inside the communication. We're not always listening to the whole communication. And when I say listening to the whole communication, and this is something that when I teach listening in workshops, when I teach it in my trauma informed communication course, this is something that we really expand on. Like, what are all of the ways that we could be listening that we are not listening with our whole body, in fact, right? And so, because we are on edge, because we are making these assumptions, because we are in our protect mode, for whatever the reason, then we often jump to judgment and fail to clarify. We fail to clarify what we've heard that another person has said. We fail to clarify the intention behind the communication. And we often fail to clarify what is it that the other person heard, especially if they are becoming more defensive, right? Now, that is not to say we cannot always control, even if they heard what we said and they're bristled by that. We don't know why that is. We don't know what that activated in the person that could be from a past wound. We don't know that information and we can't control that information, but we can clarify, right? And then we can dig deeper. If a person is bristled, we can dig deeper and investigate. That is, again, something that we go really deep on when I do my work in trauma informed communication. This is what it means to be trauma informed and trauma responsive in communication, in interaction, moment to moment, in our listening and our speaking. But just to chunk it right back down to clarification, right? What does that look like? If you notice for yourself that there's something that someone said and it hits you the wrong way, how do you clarify? It can be very simple. This is what I heard you say. This is how it landed for me. Was that your intention? Understanding that intention doesn't equal impact, right? Or when you see someone and they're getting bristled, you can ask the question, what did you hear me say and how did that land for you? Because I notice that your energy has shifted or you seem to have, and you're naming what you notice, right? So that's the simple language of clarification. And so when we fail to clarify, it leaves that opening, it leaves that room for judgment to creep in. Because when we don't clarify, when we rely on our assumptions, and basically the assumption is the gap between what you hear and what it means that you make up, right? That you make up. It's the story that is positioned in between the communication and your listening. And the clarification fills that gap in. And sometimes it's not just one question that needs to be clarified. Sometimes it takes a whole conversation just to clarify communication and meaning. And so, as an example, I'm in communication, with people all day long, and particularly my partner, Dr. Jill Weiner, and we were in a conversation one day, and I was saying something, and I noticed that there was some energy that was sort of bristled energy in her, and so I asked, well, okay, well, she responded to me in a way that I thought, oh, you know what? I don't think she got what I was saying. I don't think she understood what I was saying. And we were communicating, by the way, asynchronously, meaning that we have a video app called Marco Polo, and we were communicating asynchronously. And what happened was we were the communication was getting lost. There were assumptions that were being made based on our own listening, based on our own filters, our own backgrounds. And so at some point, I picked up the phone and I said, what is it? We need to talk because I feel like I'm saying something and you're hearing something different. And so she said what she heard. And in fact, it was similar, but not exactly what I had communicated. And then I was able to modify my communication. So this speaks to the flexibility of communication. And then she shared her perspective with me on the situation. And I felt a bristle. And so I clarified what I heard her say. And I'll tell you, it did take some back and forth of clarification until we came to an understanding of the intention behind what each of us was saying, regardless of that impact, right? So we acknowledged the impact, and we came to the agreement of the intention, and were able to come to a resolution of that. It wasn't a conflict per se, but it was just a misunderstanding based on our own filters and based on different kind of listening. And so take this with you, because I think that this is especially important in organizations, in leadership, where in collegial relationships where you have two people maybe of different backgrounds, maybe of from different cultures, and the assumption is made and the judgment is made about what a person means, how a person feels, how a person is reacting without the without the clarification. And when we do that, it leads to long-term, long-standing conflict and misunderstandings. And so, of course, as you know, I love to invite you to take this out into the world and practice it, apply it in your life, in your leadership positions, in your families, because this is relevant in partnership and this is relevant in parenthood as well. So I talk about organizations, between colleagues, leaders, and and their teams, right? But this is also relevant in your partnerships and your friendships and your parenthood, in your siblingships, your familiar relationships. And so go apply this in your life. As you're listening, become aware of the assumptions you could be making about the communication itself and about the intention of the communication. Even if it's a positive communication, even if you could even be assuming something is nothing is wrong, or you could be assuming that everything is good. Practice while the communication is normal, right? Practice without the conflict of clarifying the meaning. What I heard you say is this. Is that what you meant? Is that what you intended to say? Is that the energy that you were intending? So practice while it's good, because when you practice while it's good, then when something arises that feels sticky, especially when that um, sympathetic, sort of activation system starts to go off, threat detection system goes off, then you will have practiced clarification. All right. And these are the kind of these just applying these few tips, you can actually see some amazing changes in your relationships, in your communication, in your leadership, in your confidence. And with a deeper dive in learning in these tools, you can completely transform the way you communicate and the way people hear you and listen to you. And this is what I do, and this is what I teach others to do. I help leaders create cultures where their people feel seen, heard, respected, valued, and welcome, so that the organization and everyone in it can grow and thrive. And whether it's your organization at work or your organization of your family, this is important. So if you're a leader within an organization and you're committed to bringing this type of deep level of communication, psychological safety, growth, and development in your organization, let's talk. I'd love to come and speak at your trainings, conferences, employee resource groups, leadership retreats. And I also invite you to check out our trauma informed communication course. It's called Communication That Transforms. And there's a free preview right on the website. So, with that, I bid you adieu for this episode. As always, I'm committed to seeing you empowered, because this is the conversation that is going to transform not only our families, but our communities, our organizations, and the next generation. So have a great rest of the week. And until we see each other again, stay